All right. Hello, everyone. I am excited you're all back. Excuse me, my throat is just full of froggies, and my lap is full of doggies. And that was not meant to rhyme, but here we are, right on time. Okay, I'm done. Princess Bride on Quibble, just watch it. All right. So, my friends, thank you so much for joining us again. We are very happy to bring you back to day 2, the Q&A fireside chat. This is going to be an hour of really great discussion around all the things that we talked about yesterday. Did you do your homework? Did everybody do their homework? Maybe some people are doing some last minute cram session on their homework before they jump on. But we have an amazing panel here with us today to talk about the CIC process, like we were talking about yesterday with Cora Iberkleid and Andreas Evers. So excuse me. So they will be back, of course. And we also have with us Paul Charkovsky-Golievsky, Lyle Murphy, Mark Fisher, and Mark Pollock. All of them very well versed in the Kubernetes functions, and of course, in particular, talking about the CI/CD experience that we're trying to share with you all today. Is everybody on? Is everybody got their cameras on, ready to be introduced? We're going to talk again for about an hour. Hi, everybody. There they are. Paul, of course, is sitting in his fire. Everything's fine.
It is a fireside chat.
I see what you did there. Very well done. So yes, thank you all for joining us. We're very, very happy to share this next hour with you. And I think without further ado, I'm just going to hand it over to Cora and Andreas and let the magic begin. I know we also have Ivan online. He'll be, oh, that's right. If you have any cues for your Q&A, push the button down there and add them. Ivan will be monitoring that. He might interject with some good questions if we need those during the whole hour we have. We do have a couple to start us off, which is great. So again, thank you for joining us. Add your questions to the Q&A. And without further ado, Cora and Andreas.
Awesome. I love the background little clips. I think I'm going to need them in my daily life. Whenever I do something well, I'm going to expect applause or laughter or encouragement. Oh. Yeah. Thank you. So yeah, we're super excited. We're really, we had a lot of fun. Andres and I had a lot of fun preparing the talk yesterday. We're glad we had so many people joining. Definitely the homework is out there for you guys to walk through the whole process on your own and really see the nitty gritty of it. And today we're very honored to have this panel of very experienced, very wise folks to talk about some of these subjects with us. So I'm actually going to ask each of them to introduce themselves, and I'm just going to go based on the order in which I see them on my screen. So I'm going to start with Lyle.
Hi. I have my kids preparing for lunch in the background, so we'll see how that goes. Lyle Murphy. I am one of the product management leaders previously from Pivotal, and now came over and joined VMware.
Awesome. And so then I guess Paul.
Hi. So Paul Charkovsky. I am a advocate at Pivotal. At VMware. I need to remember where I am now. I'm at VMware, and I focus on the Kubernetes experience, DevOps, and that sort of stuff.
Awesome. And then Mark Fisher.
Hi, I'm Mark Fisher. I was a member of the Spring team starting around 2006, and mostly focused on integration and messaging. And about 3 years ago, I sort of shifted into a more focus on the Kubernetes developer experience. I'm currently at VMware integrating with the Knative team and other parts of our portfolio.
Awesome. And Mark Pollock.
Yeah, also a longtime member of the Spring team, where I worked on some messaging and somewhat short-lived version of Spring for .NET. Now work primarily on the Dataflow product, which has some CI/CD components in it, and along with Cora, helped create the original version of the Spring One-Tour CI/CD talk before the virus canceled the actual live date.
This is true. That was true. Awesome. So we're really glad you're all here. We have, so we had questions come up during the talk yesterday. We answered a few of them through the Q&A. But I'm going to kick this off with one particular question which came up a few times. It's just to provide some clarity. We got questions around dependencies. We were talking in the beginning of the presentation about building images, and we presented a project called Cloud Native Build Packs. We showed it working with a CLI called Pack, and then we showed it working with a hosted service called KPack. And we were speaking about it in comparison as a way to get away from using Docker files, which introduce challenges. And so there's a lot of questions about whether or not there's dependencies still with Docker files or the Docker daemon, and then there's questions of Docker versus OCI. So I wanted to throw the ball to you, Mark Fisher, for this one. If you could help bring clarity to this whole situation.
I can try to bring clarity. I might bring more confusion, but and others can jump in. I think so. I would maybe focus initially on the concept of the OCI image layout, which is a standardization of which a Docker build file can create such an image, but so can a Cloud Native build pack. And so in that respect, they're distinct. Docker Cloud Native build packs do not use Docker files. I think some of the confusion comes in because there are other parts of Docker. There's also Docker as a runtime for containers. And with Cloud Native build packs, there are many different, I think in the session yesterday, they were described as the tools that can execute Cloud Native build packs. They can run in a Tekton task. They can run with KPack on the cluster. There's a growing ecosystem around those. And one of those is the Pack CLI. The Pack CLI uses Cloud Native build packs lifecycle, but it runs that lifecycle using Docker as the runtime. So that's the distinction there. It goes the other direction as well for tools like Kaneko that can build with a Docker file to create an OCI compliant image, but not actually using Docker. So those things are kind of mutually exclusive in a way that can be distinct from each other.
I guess on that note, also, how important is that? When is it important? And you know, that's to you, Mark, or to like an open question to the panel. Like, when is it important that there is or isn't a dependency on Docker daemon? I guess generally is that's what the question, right?
Right. So I think the most important thing is the runtime portability. Being able to take that same image, run it locally using Docker run, or push it into a Kubernetes pod in your manifest. And so you have portability of that, but that doesn't necessarily mean it's actually Docker as the runtime.
And what about maybe at build time? How important is it for us to get away from, when does it matter? And how does it matter? Why is it impactful to be or not be dependent on Docker?
Maybe
for a build?
I could take this one.
Yeah.
I have some opinions. So I think
Sure.
it's pretty important when we're offloading that Docker build to some other service, especially as we're running more and more things in Kubernetes, including our build processes. I think it's important to move away from requiring root inside the container, but also requiring things like privileged containers or just general elevated requirements. Especially now, we're all getting pretty good at building and running secure Kubernetes clusters, and a lot of us are now really building out clusters with pod security policies enabled and tightened down to restrict a lot of that stuff. Although having good tight pod security policies also gives you a somewhat safer ability to run some systems like build systems as root or with elevated permissions. But ideally, if you're doing builds on a Kubernetes cluster, you are doing it without the need for Docker and or the required sort of root / elevated privileges. There's a lot of reasons. Not every project is there yet, but I think it is kind of a goal for most projects that are involved in building images to get to that point.
That's interesting. I remember, I mean, it's interesting that you say that, because I think when I even think about Jib, Jib not requiring Docker, my you know, one of my first thoughts of where that's relevant is in a CI system. But really, your point is even further. Like when your CI system is running in Kubernetes, then there's some other considerations as well.
But even if it's not, like Jenkins shouldn't have root access on whatever host it's installed on, right? Because it's a potential attack vector. And so that then also goes to the similar set of problems if it's calling Docker that does have root access. So even outside of Kubernetes, I think it's important. But Kubernetes, I think, is really just kind of forcing the issue in a lot of ways.
So another sort of area of conversation is this general concept, I think, of just GitOps and this buzzword of GitOps. And it makes me think back to the days of the word microservices and whether or not that term led to conclusions that maybe were or were not relevant, appropriate, productive. So I want to just throw this question out to the panel. What do you think of the word GitOps? Does it have to be Git? Does it have to be one repo? Does it have to be two repos? Does it matter? Do we want to keep our things together? Cloud 12-factor apps that said everything should be one repo, should be everything you need for an application. And then GitOps comes around and says, well, put your ops file separately. So now we have two sources of information at least, right? Is there a wrong way to do it? And whoever wants to take this question.
Well, I can start. Yeah, I can start. I mean, I guess I'm not as inflamed around the marketing term GitOps as others are on this call, but I'll let them speak to that. But I think as an approach, it's really talking about versioning files. And so Git is, a nice catchy word, and it's easy to create a new prefix for ops. But really, it's about managing that complexity, right? And then seeing how that declarative nature can be synced to what's running, right, and make sure it's consistent. So that's one way to do it. There are many ways to do it. We can talk about all the different ways, but the goal is kind of the same. And the tool and the approach has been pretty effective, I think. People are succeeding with it, no matter what you call it. So yeah, I think there's some good nuggets to take away from that approach, right? And over time, they'll really develop these better standards. And it's evolved now a lot more than it was 2 years ago when the term was first coined. So yeah, I'll start the discussion there. So who wants to pick up?
Yeah, I think it's important to separate the term from the things that are really good about it. So I definitely have opinions around the fact that GitOps is really a marketing term. And when you take two things and join them together and form a new word, it's automatically exclusionary, right? Like even DevOps, where it's supposed to be all-inclusive, everyone's a DevOps. Really, you've said it's developers and operators. So I think there's some exclusionary stuff there. And it's very easy to fall in the trap of going for the process over the people, just like we accidentally did a lot of times with Agile, even though they specifically said people over process. So I think going underneath just the tight definition of GitOps and looking at the concepts, I think is where you see the real gold there. And of course, storing everything in Git, or at least most things in Git, is a good idea because you do get those versioning things. Although, passwords and secrets in Git, I'm not really sure, even if they're encrypted, is that the best way we should be handling those? And GitOps would say yes, and other folks might say no. And certainly there's lots of ways of using Git and Git workflows to have similar results without it being, capital G GitOps.
Yeah, I mean, I'll maybe literally take a philosophical twist here and say that I think that one way of looking at GitOps is like the analogy of the cave by Plato, where Git is the source of truth and the desired state in the cluster is just a reflection of that. And what's really important is where you draw that line. I've also heard the comment, you either have one source of truth or multiple sources of lies. And so it's really a matter of who actually owns this. I mean, like in the demo yesterday, seeing when ArgoCD driving the process would actually make the update to the desired state in the cluster. But I think people start down the Kubernetes path and then they are thinking that the API server and the resources that are represented and stored in etcd are actually the representation of the source of truth. But if you step back a level, then Git is really the source of truth. Kubernetes is where you have the reconciliation of that and constantly trying to make it so, but it's not guaranteed to be so because of the environment that is running in and all of the other interactions and the limited resources and other things that can happen. So you lose the state in Kubernetes is ephemeral. You don't have an auditable record of everything that changed for all of history, but you can have that with the version control system. So they work together really well. I think it's a kind of yin and yang relationship.
It's
Yeah, I
the
would
eventual
comment on
reconciliation.
Yeah,
Go ahead, Mark.
Sorry, I would just comment the one versus many. I mean, it really depends on what kind of company you're in and what their organizational rules are. And in a way, the flexibility around permissioning and the Git repo is not granular enough to be around directories. So the easiest thing to do is, if developers are supposed to be restricted in some sort of Sarbanes-Oxley-like manner to never have an opportunity to touch anything in production, the easiest thing to do is create a separate repo where the developer doesn't have access, right? But not every company operates in that way. But if, for example, you had much finer grained control at the file level, you'd probably see different patterns emerge. So really, in a way, I bet you there's some version control system out there that I don't know that has that, but it's probably not really being popularized very much, or maybe it doesn't exist, but it could in principle, right? So in some ways, that practice is dictated by the tools you have like at hand. So Jenkins X creates one repo per environment. So if you have dev and a QA and a test 2 environment and a prod environment, then you have 5 repos for all that. It has to manage that simply because that was the unit of granularity that Git provides, right? And a lot of people just piggyback off the permissioning system that you get with your version control system, which isn't maybe ideal workflow for what you want, right? So it becomes a little bit of a square peg round hole.
Yeah, and the biggest challenge for us as people focused on providing a developer experience is being able to support that spectrum that goes all the way from like an efficient interloop development to a more regulated environment with lots of different repositories and different clusters. And so making it so that you don't have to somewhere along that line shift gears and use a different tool set, but also not be overburdened by a bunch of complex tools when you're on the simpler end of that spectrum. And being able to support that, as well as all of the configurable options that we see across, every organization is going to do these things slightly differently. There are patterns that maybe you see over and over again, but they're slightly tweaked here and there, and everything needs to be configurable.
Yeah, I think the other interesting thing when you're talking larger companies is that whole, you own your own availability, and therefore you have to be cautious of how much reliance you have on external services. Like I am definitely all for using SaaS services where it makes sense. But like a good example is like yesterday we almost couldn't do the workshop, the call, because Git had a fairly major outage earlier that day. And so yeah, imagine like, and that's just a demo, right? So it doesn't really matter, but that's something you need to really consider when you're talking about your production applications, and the need to be like, if you have some self-introduced vulnerability or something's gone wrong and your only tool to correct that is a service that you don't control the availability of, you have to be very careful. And that's not saying don't do it. It's just you need to add that to your collection of risks associated with what you're doing.
I think this conversation was a really good demonstration of, like, I guess, like the upside of having a term like GitOps, where you have a group of people who powerfully understand like the set of practices that build up the sustainability and good software delivery outcomes that we can talk through here. I think what scares me about it is turning into like the new agile or the new lean or the new like microservice of our industry, where it just becomes a term that's thrown out and you miss the gap of talking through like what problem you're trying to solve or what you're trying to move towards. Like, I think both Marks brought up the idea of like, depending on what you're trying to do, single source of truth might be good for you, right? But for another company, it's like, it might be actually an anti-goal to have a single source of truth. Like, we have maybe like Lyleco and like enforces maybe 20% of my dev is like contract dev that I hire offshore. Well, I definitely don't want a single source of truth to keep track of what I'm doing, what they're doing. I need some control mechanism to keep track of that. So I think ironically in the question, we went towards what the good side of it is like you can say really short term and mean a lot of things to people who understand what the term means, but the risk of it comes back to something like agile, which is like, are you agile? Be like, yeah, I'm agile. Why are you agile? Well, I have swim lanes in Jira. It's like, oh, okay, here we go.
Right, checkbox.
Definitely sounds interesting indeed. Well, actually, when you talked about this GitOps repo concept, it got me thinking when I was preparing this demo together with Cora, we were writing all this code. It was mostly YAML code these days that we just put into this GitOps repo now. And you know, for the pipeline that we wrote, we had more than 500 lines of YAML code. And I was like, so much YAML. You know, who's going to maintain this? And who's supposed to write this? I think we had a question like that yesterday as well from the audience, and today as well. So there's a question here that says, how much should developers involve in CI/CD? Who should write this stuff? Who should maintain it? So does anyone have any idea there? Is this like DevOps? You're supposed to have a team also doing this completely on its own?
I think one of the nice trends in the Kubernetes ecosystem is the fact that you can create higher level experiences, but not be a black box. So typically you'll have, like with CRDs, you'll have a higher level resource that creates the lower level resources for you. So you go from 200 lines of YAML to 500 lines of YAML. And then there's another higher level resource on top of that. And yet at the same time, if you ever need to drop down and inspect the lower level, you can. And so I think that's the responsibility of people building tools on this ecosystem, is to hide as much of that as you can, but not by sweeping it under the rug, right?
Yeah, I agree. I think anytime you have to reach to YAML, it's exposing a gap in your platform tooling, right? A gap that you should be working to fill. Obviously, you need to decide which gaps to fill, and you can use value stream mapping, you can use all sorts of things to figure out which of those gaps you should be filling first. Like, you should never try and solve all of these problems before you start even running your applications on Kubernetes, because you'll never actually do it. And that's the classic enterprise trap. It's, I'm gonna build out the fully fledged platform and then I'll onboard some people. You do definitely need to go for that, like, minimum viable platform I've heard people say before, where it's good enough to get going and start exposing the actual issues and the actual optimizations that are needed versus what we think we might need. So I actually think YAML being exposed is a really good like sniff test of what we need to be working on at the platform level.
Yeah, I mean, I think it takes years to build up a CI platform that is fully featured for the enterprise and has a great user experience. I mean, it's just, we're very early days of this happening in the ecosystem of Kubernetes, where you run it on Kubernetes. There might not be a real reason to adopt Tekton right away. A lot of shops might already have something. CI has been around for a very, very long time, right? So people have already made investments and they can run their tool there and have a great user experience. I think when I was developing the course, Tekton didn't even have a homepage yet, right? It was like, we'll get to it. We're sorry. We're really sorry. We're really busy. We're doing the best we can, right? So it's just early, unfortunately. And everyone wants something to be super mature, but in fact, a lot of these things are just early days.
Absolutely.
Yeah, but it's interesting as well.
Go ahead.
Mark Fisher said about having that layer of abstraction on top of your YAML. If you look at what, for instance, Jenkins X is doing, there was only one line of code that you needed in your YAML, and that would just scaffold into CRDs of Tekton and other stuff, but you could still access that. And that was actually pretty interesting, that you have this foundation underneath it that you can still access if you want to dig into it and find more. And actually, what this made me think about as well, if I wrote all this YAML, is how do we test this stuff? Like you're right. All this code, this much code. How do you have any testing for that? There's nothing, right? There's no way of testing this aside from actually deploying it and finding out what's going on, right? Also, like deployment YAMLs for production. Sure, you could put some stuff in there, but it's only going to be visible if you actually deploy this into the environment. Isn't there some kind of, what do you think? Isn't there some kind of way to make sure that this is more robust, just like we have, testing principles in software development in general? Any thoughts on this?
Do you think it might be useful to have like a mocked out Kubernetes API that you would pass it all the YAML, and then it would kind of give you a representation of the results of what Kubernetes would have done without actually going and doing it? Because I feel like if you want to test this properly, you would need to spin up a new Kubernetes cluster every single test. And that is expensive money-wise, expensive time-wise. Maybe mocking it out would give you enough confidence that you could move forward to at least further on the pipeline.
Well, yes, yeah. You've worked with a lot of YAML in your life. What has been your experience and struggles in terms of trying to figure out, what are all the fields that could go under this one? Or is this valid? Does my IDE give me any feedback? Like there's really, how, and I guess also how important is that as we move forward?
Yeah, I think it's super important because you're not only worried about like what fields, but you're also worried about what version the clusters you're targeting are running, right? And so something that works on the dev cluster might not work on the production cluster because the dev cluster has been upgraded to 1.1.9 and of Kubernetes, and the prod cluster is still behind because there are many reasons why you don't want to frequently upgrade your prod cluster if you don't have the skills and reflexes to confidently upgrade your prod cluster. So there's a lot of things, and a lot of the IDEs will look at the current version of the Kubernetes objects and give you whether they should be strings or what's valid here. But not a lot of them will actually connect to your Kubernetes cluster and ask the cluster. And the clusters are totally capable. You can say kubectl explain, and there's a few other things you can do to get exactly from the cluster what it supports and what fields it has. But I haven't seen a lot of tools really using that yet. And then, of course, you would need to do that against the representation of your dev cluster, your staging cluster, your production cluster. So there's just a lot to be done there. And for the most part, you write some stuff, you YOLO it into a Kubernetes cluster and see what happens. And hopefully that isn't production.
Yeah, I'm wondering from the Spring perspective, Spring has put so much work into making a good user experience from an API perspective, but it's maybe fundamentally, is it fundamentally different when you deal with something that's oriented towards a declarative nature, or is that as this YAML sort of affects more people, are there opportunities, are there ways, is it worth it to take those good intentions that Spring put into practice with its own APIs and DSLs for YAML or for, although I think there is a project, I always forget the name of it. It starts with a K.
Pulumi?
Not that one, but maybe there's projects where, isn't it that one? To try to use languages like TypeScript to generate YAML to start to put another face on it.
One of them. I mean, now Amazon's doing it. I guess Adamus does that as well. I mean, it's one more way to wrangle your YAML, and the fact that TypeScript lets you type things so concisely, right, that it almost looks like programmatic YAML is an obvious choice for terseness, right, versus other languages. But it's one more mechanism to control that, right? It's another generation technique, basically.
Yeah, I think that a lot of that stuff still, in a lot of ways, resides under the responsibility of the people building and running your platform, not the developers using the platform. You know, unless you have very specific requirements to tie really deeply into like the Kubernetes ecosystem for your application, like your application probably shouldn't have to know it's on Kubernetes. So I'm not sure how much tying that into your like your framework and your language makes sense. I think definitely tying it into your IDE makes a lot of sense, and tying into like your testing and mocking systems makes a lot of sense. But I'm not a huge fan of the idea of having a ton of platform-specific code in your applications themselves.
Mm-hmm. Which actually, it makes me think of another question we wanted to get to, which is this idea, you know, if the YAML is really more of it ends up being more of a underlying tool thing, right? More of a plumbing thing. You're defining the plumbing. It's not really a relevant thing for your applications. As you say, your application shouldn't have to know that it's on Kubernetes or not. So what we've noticed is, you know, two trends in the market, right? There's tools that are, like we saw yesterday, we saw Argo, KPack, very simple to use, good at one thing. And then there's of course this other maybe category of things like Tekton that are maybe intended as engines to build other systems on. But then there's another category of software, and I don't know if it falls, I started to think it falls more under the commercial maybe category of things of trying to offer an integrated solution end to end, but I don't even know if that's true. If I think back to Cloud Foundry was offering, the open source Cloud Foundry, an end-to-end solution. You just push your code and then it goes. So do you see, maybe, I don't know if Lyle, maybe you want to kick this one off, if you see between those trends, do you have any views on, you know, is one more than the other? How do they play? Are we going in one direction? Is, you know, so integrated versus point?
I'm interested to see where we end up here as a group. I think we all kind of align in some area, like the Venn diagram is some level overlap, but there's difference. To me, actually, I'm going to call back something Paul said earlier. It depends like what area of the tool chain you're swapping out and why. So like, let's say you're like, look at your value tree map and where are you optimizing? If you're looking at stuff like CI, it's, in my mind, like heavily commoditized. Many companies have made their choice and kind of what the standard is there. They've built up their own kind of custom ways to work around that and use that. Whereas if you say you're looking at replacing a homegrown deployment scripts to help me do like, this helps me do blue-green, but it's really me just like munging together a bunch of Jenkins pipelines. Like that's probably largely beneficial for an area for you to look at. I think where like something like Tekton offers is hopefully what we see more of in the future, like the shift towards this like common purpose-built tooling, kind of like the build on top of layer, to your point, Cora, I think is really powerful. I still worry though, but companies tend to try to scale too early here and they end up kind of creating that platform too early. So like it really comes to the sense of like that scale and nothing's free. So like how many apps do you actually need to be continually changing versus how many just need to keep running and then monitor if they need change versus how many you just keep running and that's it. Now, if you're like Netflix and you have this like massive thing that needs to be orchestrated and keep going and keep growing and keep evolving, taking on like let's be real, like the literal effort or challenge of running a platform like Spinnaker probably makes a lot of sense. But if you're a scale where like you're trying to manage say 10 teams or 20 teams with 2 or 3 microservices, like you're establishing a team way before you actually need one, and you're probably actually spending like I guess like your people resources the best you possibly can. Right? Like it's waiting to get to the point where you break. And I think the common trend is like the sharp, purposeful tools are great as long as you have the like the right people, practices, and behaviors to then take and use those things to the best of their ability. Because if you use them wrong, they're just going to be sharper and cut you faster.
Yeah, absolutely. Like there's a lot of argument these days about when you should build a monolith and then when you should break it up into microservices. And a lot of that focuses around company size and team size and need for speed and scalability. There's like a thing you have to figure out there. And I feel this falls into that same thing. It would be interesting to see someone try and build out based on size of company, teams, and like organization layout, like what kind of platform would best suit you. And I think we would find if you were someone like Netflix or someone like Uber, where you started off really small and grew, there's probably 2 or 3 like transition points where you almost need to transition between like major architectural changes in your platform.
Right. I think this also ties into a question from the Q&A. Actually, 2 of them. One is about whether the tools that we've shown, whether they are really production ready, or is it just a demo application like a Hello World or something. But also specifically about Jenkins X in the enterprise, is this something that you should already adopt or not? And isn't it harder to maintain all these separate tools that might not be mature versus an integrated platform? Also, of course, that has to be mature as well. So what do you think?
Yeah, it's like every start of every project involves a tool evaluation where you look and see how mature it is, right? And it's pretty easy after a week or so of poking around the repositories. Very often these are open source projects, right? So you can get a feel for the community. Do they have a NASCAR sticker flag of customers that are using it, right? What's the version number, right? If it's 0 point something, hopefully they're naming it indicative of where they think the maturity is, right? So it's an evaluation process, really, and enterprises probably never want to be on the complete bleeding edge, right? But they want to be somewhat forward-looking. So I think some things that we demoed in the presentation yesterday are more mature than others, for sure.
Yeah, I think looking at tools like Jenkins X is a good way to figure it out. Like if Jenkins X is a GA product that they sell and support, there's probably a good sign that the underlying tools are production ready, assuming they haven't majorly forked and modified them, which I don't know if you can necessarily tell. But then if you're doing that, you should probably pay Jenkins X or CloudBees some money and use their platform versus building your own, because that's still just a small portion of your overall platform, and it's already so big and so gnarly and such a spider web. Like, just like pay them money and use their integrated solution that you still need to integrate with a bunch of like glue with everything else. So it's not like you're going to be out of a job by buying Jenkins X.
So how careful should we be in adopting this stuff? And not just about, like we discussed this about GitOps, right? That you should look at the essence of GitOps, not necessarily the marketing around it, but like things like ChatOps, which is also a buzzword these days. Like, does everybody need this? Is this for every team, even if you're co-located, sitting together? What do you think?
I'll jump in first on this one. The ChatOps one to me sounds like it's a solution to, like, it's a new approach to not actually solving the core root problem. Like in many cases, what you probably have instead is maybe your employer has put ServiceNow and some approval flow within ServiceNow in front of you, and that's painful, and you get blocked on it. And you're like, well, instead I'll do ChatOps. It's like all you're really doing is like, what's the trigger point that you're saying something's okay to move forward with? And if you just keep moving the buck, like all it's going to happen is eventually you'll build up critical mass where you're doing enough important things in ChatOps that whatever kind of control structures fell on you that made that ServiceNow flow difficult are just going to now happen in Slack. And now if you've done it, now you've made it really hard for the entire organization to get Slack because you're using it to trigger your production deployments. Like it just moves the problem. So I think at a surface level, it seems really powerful and interesting because you don't have to go through like a ticketing system and email. At some point, you hit this critical mass where the constraint control groups of your employer will still find it and they'll lock it down just in different ways. and then chat ops become some other ops way to trigger it until that gets successful, and it just keeps rolling in on itself.
Yeah, I think ChatOps became really popularized when GitHub was kind of doing it internally, and they had a major outage with their networking gear that they solved with their ChatOps tooling, and so they built a bunch of presentations about that and went around the country talking about it. And so everyone decides they needed to do ChatOps because it's going to solve all of these problems for us. But what we ended up with is it just like most people, when they say they do ChatOps, they just mean they have like robots yelling at them in Slack. And we're done. And the last thing we need is like more noise on Slack. It's promoting that interrupt driven work versus like helping remove the interrupts. And so like sending it to Slack versus sending it to my pager, it's no different.
Feels like pull requests in a team that's sitting next to each other. It's like, I got some work, I committed, then it's sitting there and pull request, and 2 weeks later somebody looks at it, and that person doesn't know what's going on. I don't know what's going on because I context switched. And now I have
not
to
a replacement for a dashboard sometimes. But
Yeah.
it's useful, I think, in the case that Paul described as a firefighting technique, right? Where everyone gets on the same page really quickly and you're interacting in real time, but it has a lifespan of, few minutes, right? In terms of context.
Maybe I'll throw at you a question just from the Q&A. Someone asks, what do you think about organizations that are doing microservices and not doing containers and orchestration, hundreds of microservices?
I think that's great. I think Kubernetes is great, but the thing that makes Kubernetes great is not that it orchestrates containers. It's the things that are above that. It's the reconciliation loops. It's the way that we're building it all into the platform versus building it into the meatware around the platform. And you look at Netflix as the primary example. Like, I think they use containers a bit now, but for the longest time they didn't. But you look at a lot of the tools and techniques, and they are pretty similar. And so I think what containers did and what Kubernetes is doing at a container orchestration level is giving us like a reset point where we can say we can start using some of these more modern processes and techniques and step away from our older systems that we have such a platform built around them that we can't really modify them. And so let's start afresh with this new stuff and start kicking the tires, and then maybe start moving some stuff towards it.
I think when you try some of these tools, to get back, not to be completely negative, my immediate reaction of integrating with ArgoCD was like, I tried this out, it worked. Oh my God, that's really cool. Maybe let me do a little bit more. As compared to being writing external code, right, to your meat point, I guess, never heard it called that, which was doing all of this programmatically. Right now, I just deploy this thing, the patterns are built in, and looks like it's working. I got immediate value. And I was like, great. I'm sure I could break it, right? If I really do something crazy, like change something drastically. But if you do small incremental changes, just seem to work. And so when you're looking at like adopting something and seeing if it passes, the smell tests, when you get that good initial feedback loop from going to the project page or the download, and you realize you just saved yourself a ton of work. Sure, you have to understand how it works in the cover. Sure, there'll be bugs, but it's clearly packaged up a core problem and solved it in a nice way. And even if it's young, it's like better than rolling my own, most likely.
Yeah, and I think right now we're in obviously a period of innovation. A lot of these technologies are new and evolving, and it's a good thing. And there's maybe, it will look different in a few years, and there might be less competition and more convergence. But I think anytime we're in a period like this, the important thing is to focus on what can be standardized as sort of those handoff points between these tools so that you can mix and match. And so things like the container image specification is obviously critically important. They can all rely on that. The resource YAML definitions in Kubernetes, and there are trends for things like duck typing of resources, so that any image that has this field in its, or sorry, any resource that has this field in its status can be reconciled by this reconciler. That's an interesting way to think sort of like interfaces in the resources within a cluster. And also think some of the work around cloud events to standardize some of the types of things. We're doing a lot of experimentation there, where, for instance, a pull request is a cloud event type. In Knative eventing, they have a GitHub source with pull request cloud event types. There's also cloud event types for an image being updated in a registry. And so any number of these tools can react to that. That can sit in front of a Tekton trigger. It can sit in front of something that's applying changes directly into your Kubernetes cluster. So you can mix and match these different tools, and you can experiment with something and not feel like you're locked in for good because that piece could be replaced.
Yeah, that replaceable plumbing thing is the important thing, right? Like, what's really good about Tekton is we're building up a set of like interchangeable, composable things. And the future of Tekton could be not even on Kubernetes, right? Because really all Tekton is an API specification and something that can like act on that API specification. Kubernetes or not, those two things are super valid. And so I think that's where we've really come a long way, is realizing that we need to have like standard composable units with a standard way of representing the API. We just haven't figured out how to put the right UX on top of it yet.
Lyle, you look like you want to say something.
I was going to say, like, Mark Pollock's point really was helpful for me to kind of separate the time when you're improving for the future versus like writing things right now. Like when you're taking the time to like, oh, I'm going to experiment and try this thing and see like where in my my development workflow activities this can make my job easier. But then there's like a balance between doing that and then keeping track of like, if you have something just running and working, for example, like Kelsey Hightower has this great talk about like leaving your data services on VMs. Like if you can do that right now and you can trust that and it works for you, like don't just like as of Monday try to move to running your data services on like in Kubernetes, because like you're gonna probably have a really hard time. Like don't swap out for the net new powerful like exciting new tools that your team doesn't know how to use. Like focus on what your team knows how to use, like from like the stability side of your business, and then invest that time to experiment to make sure you have that free time within like your week, within your month, whatever else, to try out new tools to evolve for the future. But don't just jump to the newest thing, deploy your tools to it, and now you end up with maybe the latest greatest tech being your platform, but the team has no idea how to use them.
And Mark also mentions these little tools that we might compose into to whatever we need, purpose-built tools. Aren't there any other tools that you see that are out there that we didn't mention in the talk yesterday? Anything that you came across that might solve some problems as well? Especially something with the testing, perhaps. There was a question yesterday that was about when you go to production, how do you actually make sure that whatever is deployed in production is working? We've seen Spinnaker, of course, that has some features for that, but I also saw Flagger, for instance. Anyone who knows anything about that?
Yeah, I haven't used it. I've only read about it, but it's similar to Argo rollouts and other things that are undergoing this marketing term, progressive delivery, which is yet another term. But the idea is, to slowly roll something out and see how it goes. It's a spectrum, right? You could deploy all of version 2 and make sure they're all healthy by their endpoint, and then remove version 1. Or you could deploy version 2 just to one geographic location, one app, and measure its response time and know all of your time series curves and have a data model that describes it and know if the thing is working well or not, right? There's a lot of difference between those two data points, right? And a lot of complexity to manage and things to understand. So A lot of times people probably just wing it by looking, right? They probably run top on the machine and say, looks good, and then they hit another button. So automation is key, right? For a lot of people, they want to move fast and have less manual steps. But yeah, just don't. Yeah, there was. I mentioned this when we were talking. There's this great Homer Simpsonism, max powers. Like there's 3 ways to do it: the max power way, the right way, and the wrong way. And the max power way is like the wrong way, but faster. You know, you can give people these tools, and then they'll just drive themselves to oblivion. You don't really know what the hell you're doing, and you'll do it really quick. So yeah, it's just a question of maturity, I guess, right? Start small, and then, you know, the system we developed in Dataflow is the world's simplest blue-green deployment. It's like on the spectrum of choices, really, really simple, and people are okay with that by and large. Could be better, there's no doubt, but you don't have to bring the big guns right away.
Yeah, a sensible default that people can work from is perfect.
Yeah, guys, there's a huge bias with all of us here being close to like Spring and everything else, but like to me, it boils down to like, do your tests indicate real failures? And if they don't, what health indicators are you actually trying to use when you're doing all this automation? I think that's where the power of a framework like Spring comes in. It's like to Mark's point, like it makes it a lot easier to get a lot of those things for free. It doesn't mean you don't have to put the work in, but it means it's a little bit easier to get closer. But once again, if you have an app that has some tests, and those tests don't indicate any kind of real failures or any defects or any health indicators, it's really hard to do any kind of automation going forward that isn't just the max power way. Like I'm just going to deploy to prod faster, and like you'll get there. You're just going to expedite how fast you get punched in the face. So
yeah, our friends at Microsoft have some pretty good tooling around this internally, where they call them rings, I think, and like their first ring is staff, then they have like friendly users, and they have like 3 or 4 rings until everyone is in that ring. And basically they roll out new versions through those rings. They have the appropriate routing and load balancing to make sure the right people are getting to the right versions. And you know, that seems to work really well. But boy, especially when you've got like lots of microservices, there's a lot of work in coordinating that so that it works, right? So you have to figure out where on the spectrum of that you need to be as far as the effort you're putting in organizationally to make it work. Hopefully tools like Flagger, tools like Istio and other service meshes will make it easier for us to access things like that and actually implement things like that without having to really sweat the minutiae and the details as much.
Yeah, now on this topic, I think circling back to one of the discussions earlier about GitOps. Well, first, if we think of this all as the picture from that kept recurring yesterday in the session of the entire path to prod from code to deployment, I think at each one of those stages, maybe to Lyle's point, you want to increase your confidence for the next stage, but you can never completely have 100% confidence, which means at the end of the day, in production, you have to be able to deal with something going wrong. And this, in terms of like GitOps, you're not, we were talking about where the state lives. The state associated with your rollout is not something, you don't commit, 10%, okay, commit, manifest at 20%. These are things that happen more ephemerally within the reconciliation engine, using the traffic routing capabilities of a service mesh and using something like the support for revisions within Knative deployments. So you can very quickly react in the cluster and ideally create a new automation loop there where based on something going wrong, you do the rollback immediately. And so you take all the Git repos out of that loop. You definitely take the people out of the loop. Have to have that in place.
I'm gonna turn our attention a little bit. I just want to make sure we have like 6 minutes left. So I want to make sure to go through the Q&A and get people's questions answered. So let me start with, let's pick one randomly here. How do we maintain the security features in Kubernetes clusters? And what do you recommend best practices or approaches? So in 6 minutes, we have about 4 questions to get through. So we're rapid fire style if anybody wants to
So yeah, I mean, really, you want to be using a platform that has a lot of security features built in. So pod security policies and enforcement, net security policies and enforcement. You have tools that will inspect and reject the kube manifests themselves. So if they don't have the right things, it'll just say, no, you can't deploy these. And then, of course, you've also got tools that will inspect and reject your images themselves for vulnerabilities and other things. So those are like table stakes, bare minimum. If you don't have those things, why are you using Kubernetes? You know, there are plenty of reasons maybe you are, but like if you don't have those things, you better be working towards having those things, because you're one bug, you're one struts vulnerability away from a pretty major disaster.
Another point I think is isolating the different responsibilities. And so it also gets back to that spectrum. When you're just developing and you have a single cluster running on your laptop, then you're going to have everything in there, the Tekton builds and your apps, and you're living in that world. But in a production environment, it should be a different cluster hosting your workloads than a cluster that's running your Tekton tasks or running your image builds.
Right.
I think we actually have a question that says precisely, right, where should you run? If you have multiple clusters, what should you do? Exactly that, yeah.
Who's got the car alarm? Oh, there it goes.
That's me, I'm sorry, I'm sorry.
You must be in New York.
This is the sound of my life. There's another question here in the Q&A. In your experience, what is the best, what is the best cloud managed Kubernetes service available right now? Of course, you're talking to a bunch of VMware people.
Look, they're all great. Arguably, GKE is the oldest and most mature. They all have things they're good at. They all have things they're not good at. But the main thing is, tell me you're not hand installing and configuring Kubernetes yourself, right? That's where I draw the line and say too much. I'm like, obviously we're VMware, so we're all for you running Kubernetes yourself, but not by tapping at a keyboard. But yeah, absolutely use VMwares. Buy our stuff. I like to get paid.
Buy our stuff. Yeah. I think we got all the Q&A, because I think the first question we got that one earlier, the first one that's left there, I see, and then the other one is about how would you fit in secret management, keeping them encrypted? I don't know if this falls under the same thing you were talking about, Paul, before. If there's something to add there about, if anybody want to add about secrets in particular.
I think there's an interesting.
Yeah, it's separate, than what Paul was talking about. We only have 2 minutes left, but
go for it.
There are a variety of techniques, right? There's Bitnami sealed secrets. There's HashiCorp Vault is popular, and there's Mozilla SOPs with a KMS behind it. And like everything in security, it's dangerous to really make recommendations unless you're in the weeds of it. But there are a few patterns out there that you could research on your own and determine like where you are and how secret it needs to be. I do like the term that default secrets on Kubernetes is called encryption. So you should avoid that. It's just base 64 encoded. So that's not something to rely on at all.
I really like the HashiCorp Vault integrations we're starting to see, where they actually have a like a storage driver, and so you're literally getting your secrets as files in a drive attached to your pods, and that's super exciting, because that doesn't like Kubernetes never sees the content of those secrets, right? Nothing but the things that are allowed to see that drive have access to the secrets.
Yeah, I think that technique is across different approaches as well. How the secret gets exposed to the container, and this idea of rings of security. Is it on a file system? Is it an in-memory file system? Is it actually stored in etcd somewhere or not? Like, it's complicated. Unfortunately, there's no great answer. And in part, that's a little bit the reason why when you look at something like Jenkins X, it says, we'll use Vault. And you're like, oh, crap, now there's another server, right? So when you try and provide a product that has so much features, then you end up having a lot of complexity to meet those needs, because
Yeah.
you have to put together all these incidental pieces to make sure they string together.
Yeah.
It's unfortunate there isn't a better out-of-the-box answer than encryption.
Yeah, and those tools are like incredibly difficult to do right and to run right. Like if you're running Vault properly, you need to be having at least monthly like key ceremonies where you're validating that the people that have the right keys can still unlock and relock the stores and all sorts of stuff.
Although I wouldn't mind spending time turning the key simultaneously with someone. That'd be fun to do every month.
I think there's an obligatory mention of sidecars here in this context as well, as one way to manage secrets that are still decoupled from the application itself. That's another trend to interact with a proxy that's where the secrets are, and they can be rotated at that point.
The closing like 5-second thing is urging you not to do it yourself. That's all. I've found a few companies throughout the years that are doing this themselves. If you're a 3-letter acronym like government agency and you have to do this yourself, that's unfortunate. But if you're not, don't do this yourself. There's a handful of great vendors in this space. Reach out to them. They have best practices built up and leverage those. Yeah. Just don't do it yourself.
Awesome. Unfortunately, we're out of time, but this has been a great discussion. We're so glad, so thankful that you all joined us, and thank you for sharing your expertise and your opinions with us. Thanks to everybody, all the participants who were here, and your excellent Q&A. Thank you. Last question on the Q&A. The category course will be available indefinitely. We're not taking it down. Take your time.
That was a great horn. Well timed.
Yeah, thanks.
The ending horn. Well, thank you to our panelists. Lyle, thanks for joining us from the set of Seinfeld. It was good that Kramer didn't jump in at any point in time to bother us. Of course, Cora and Andreas, so happy to have you yesterday and today. Thank you so much. It was great information. And the two Marks, not to lump you together, but Mark and Mark, thank you so much. And of course, Paul Tchaikovsky, I hope you can find a fire extinguisher to get that fire, because your fire in your fireplace seems to have expanded rapidly. But everything is fine as always. And yeah, we have another one of these next month, which is incredible. We're very excited to have, hold on, let me just pull up exactly. Oh yes, of course. It's the indomitable Josh Long. If you don't know who Josh Long is and you're part of the Spring world, then I don't know why you don't know about him, and you should definitely come. It's July 22nd and the 23rd, Spring Tips in Reactive Spring. So it'll be similar. We'll have day one where Josh is just going to be talking about Spring Tips in Reactive Spring and giving demos and sharing all of the Josh Long stuff with as much information in a short amount of time as possible. And then the next day we'll have a nice fireside chat with him and probably bring in some other wonderful Spring people as well. And so that's next month, again, July 22nd to 23rd. You can register now at springonetour.io. We also have later today, Tanzu Tuesdays, our every Tuesday event from 1 p.m. to roughly 2:30 p.m. Pacific every Tuesday. I'm on that one. Paul will be there as well with Tiffany Jernigan. And today's amazing guest is Olga, and I'm going to have to butcher her last name again because she is got a wonderful Polish last name, it's Marczysiek Sharma. Anybody else can help me with that?
Nope, you're on your own.
Okay, got it.
I can only say one Polish name, and that's my own.
Right, and barely that's yours. Yes, and that's just Polish hot dog or kielbasa. So anyway, we're very excited to have Olga. She's going to be talking about Spring Cloud Contract, and we also have our huge Spring One 2-day convention, all virtual. Sadly, we're not going to be in Seattle this year for that, but we have so many talk tracks and so many amazing presenters. So go to spring1.io and you can register to attend that. It's again all virtual and all free. So make sure you do that, and go to our VMware Tanzu developer page at tanzu.vmware.com/developer and check out all the different things that you can learn to create create your developer experience here with the Tanzu people, trying to make enterprise developing that much easier. I don't know, just helping you along that journey, because we're all in together, and we might as well do it as a community. So please go there. And I think that's all of my nitty gritty stuff that I have to get out to you. Again, I want to thank Cora and Andreas for your time, for putting together these last 2 days. This has been wonderful. Jamie DiMartini, who's our main producer of the show, Tasha Eisenberg, Brandon, Yvonne, Ben, Paul, who was in charge of the laugh track and the applause meters. So this was great. We're very, very happy. And of course, our panelists today, Lyle, Mark, and Paul.
Right,
I hope everyone
before
stays
we wrap
safe.
up,
Oh, yes.
2 things real quick. Sweet Killer 9, friend of
Oh,
the
right,
show,
yes.
is on, and he said, awesome session. Moving from one session to another was really delightful. So I think he actually was bouncing between Zoom and Twitch. So he was using our platform to its best. And then I had one last thing, which is, what is a pirate's favorite Kubernetes tool? ArgoCD.
He's even got the button ready for it. He's even got the button ready.
Does it count when you do the button for your own jokes?
No, it never.
The funniest jokes are the ones where you don't even laugh yourself and you need the laugh track. That's how you know you've got the real gem of a joke.
We need to cue the crickets track as well. Yes, that's right. If we go to twitch.com/makejar.war, that's where Tanzu Tuesdays is, and that's where people that didn't register in time could watch. So Sweet Killer 9, I know Spencer Gibb was on there yesterday, so we had some really great kind of usual suspects from our Tanzu Tuesday still tuning in. So thank you so much, everybody. Over
and if you go to tanzu.tv, you will see all of the stuff that we are streaming to Twitch, the various shows, and also a bunch of back catalog stuff we have up on YouTube. Tanzu.tv on your favorite internet website browser.
We're doing it, everybody. Thank you again. Be safe. Take care of each other. Bye.
Bye. Thank you.